So thank you so much for inviting me here today, and I'm really glad to be talking on such an important and relevant topic. And unfortunately, I feel like 15 minutes isn't enough to do it justice, but I hope I can go through some of the initiatives that we're trying to put forward at Nature to address some of these issues. So the first thing I'd like to stress is the difference between terms, so difference between sex and gender. So sex refers to the different biological and physiological characteristics of males and females. This is a World Health Organization definition, whereas gender refers to the socially constructed characteristics of women and men. So it's kind of easy to think about it in terms of sex being to do with, differences in chromosomes, reproductive organs, whereas sex is more to do with, gender is more to do with things like women like shoes and shopping and men like football, or pink and blue differences, things like that. So one of the core aims of the Sustainable Development Goals is to tackle inequality, in particular gender equality, and to try and achieve female empowerment by 2030. However, the most recent SDG report has shown that we're still very far away from this target. So what I'm going to discuss is try and split these into two areas. So first of all, we'll look at sex issues in brain research, the implications for biomedical research, for example, and the role of funders and journals in trying to create initiatives to help, and gender issues, and in this respect I'm talking about female underrepresentation as neuroscientists and the initiatives that we have in that area too. So to start with, sex issues, I'm sure you're all aware, as you're all here, that sex differences are really not sufficiently considered in biomedical research. And unfortunately, women are very much more likely to be misdiagnosed than men for a range of medical conditions. So this was really something that was very evident in other areas of science, but increasingly it's being recognized to be relevant across a host of brain disorders, from ADHD to stroke. And the issue is that diagnosis is traditionally derived from the study of men. And one of the further problems is that even if women are accurately diagnosed, they often end up having negative side effects as a result of the drugs that they're given, because many of these drugs have been designed for the male body. And the reality is that most of these drugs have been tested on male rodents. Preclinical models are primarily in men, in male animals, and it's understandable that this is the case. You've got limited funding, you want to reduce variability in your data, and so it's easier to study men. But really it was, this is an issue that affects everybody. It has huge tolls on people's families. Everyone, knows a woman. So it's important that we have the accurate diagnosis and treatment for women as much as men. But very surprisingly, it was only really the 1990s when this was first taken seriously. What I think is even more shocking is it took another 2 decades before funding bodies started to cotton on to the fact that it might be important to encourage people to include sex as a biological variable. And so I think Canada was the first to try and implement this in grants. The European Commission followed suit, the NIH in 2016, and the German Foundation, just to name a few funding bodies. And now it's expected that sex is included as a biological variable in research design, analysis, and reporting in both vertebrate animal but also human studies. So what are we trying to do at Nature? Really the best thing that we can do is try and advocate for this. So we try and promote editorials, perspectives, reviews, as far as we can, that put this topic to the forefront of people's minds. And just last month, we launched a collection at Nature on sex and gender in science, where we're trying to pull together a lot of the content that we have across the journals on this topic. So our perspective is that including sex as a biological variable improves reproducibility, experimental efficiency, social equality, and of course personalized medicine. And on the sort of more practical level, we try and encourage authors to follow the SAGE guidelines on reporting in sex and gender as far as we can. So you may not be able to see a large body of text there, but that's a table that comes from this paper on the right, Sex and Gender Equity in Research. And these SAGE guidelines are a really useful way of thinking about how to conduct to write up your study and consider sex and gender. So one point is that you should try and use the terms sex and gender very carefully and not confuse them. We encourage people to disaggregate their data by sex. We also encourage people to, if they're only using one sex in their studies, that they should mention that in the title and abstract. But I encourage you to read the guidelines and consider them when you're submitting your research. So finally, the other thing we try and do is publish work that is, addressing some of this bias in the literature. And I just wanted to highlight the study that we published at the start of the year. So it was a really nice study that was actually one of the first longitudinal studies to look at the effect of childbirth on the brain. And considering, nearly 85% of women experience one or more pregnancies in their lifetime, it's really pretty crazy that this is something that hasn't been studied before. So they showed that there were really pretty substantial structural cortical changes that occur as a result of giving birth. So next, I just wanted to move on to gender issues. So again, to reiterate, by this I mean socially constructed characteristics of women and men. And as we are all aware, there is a male bias in neuroscience. And I Googled what is a neuroscientist, and this is what came up on Wikipedia, a picture of Ramon Cajal. I think this is a sort of traditional stereotype of a neuroscientist. Generally, it's a black and white picture of a white man from the 19th century. And you can just look around this room to see that that's really not the case anymore, and we really need to be changing this stereotype. And I always think it's interesting to look to AI when we're thinking about stereotypes, because it can give you very clear examples of that. And I found this nice example showing that Google Translate defaults to male pronouns when it's translating gender-neutral language in STEM fields, which I thought was a nice example. But the result of this male bias is it has, effects on women's compensation. Salaries are lower, grant funding, credit for collaborative work. They have lower teaching evaluations. They're hired less, promoted less, get less authorship, and get cited less. And I'd like to say that, this is just some ideas, but these are all papers that I found that demonstrated evidence of this in neuroscience. So I just wanted to highlight a paper that we published a few years ago at Nature Neuroscience that looked at the representation of women in reference lists. So this is a work from Jordan Dworkin, Danny Bassett's group, and they looked at citation behavior. And essentially they took papers from 1995 to 2018. They took papers from the top 5 neuroscience journals, and they looked at the first author and the last author of these papers, and what these papers were citing, and the makeup of them. So I'm calling them male-led and female-led. So you can see in the blue that there's a very, very strong representation of male first and last author papers in neuroscience, and a very slim band of orange, which is women-led and women female last and first and last author. And that was the same across all the journals. So why is this? I mean, it might be that there just are more men in neuroscience, so perhaps that's the reason. So they dug a little bit more into this, and they showed that actually when they took a random pool of papers from the literature, which would sort of be a randomly cited list, they compared that with the actual citation behavior. They showed that papers that had male first and last authors tended to oversight other male first and last author groups, and quite dramatically undercite female first and last author papers. And this trend was sort of fairly evident in the female-led papers too, but to a much lesser extent, as you can see on the right. But the thing that was sad about this paper was this trend seems to be increasing over time. So they looked at how this pattern was changing over the years, and they showed that this gap seemed to be increasing. So as many of you may know, Danny Bassett's group put out ideas of putting forward citation diversity statements at the end. And this is something that is a very active, ongoing discussion at Nature. Should we try and encourage people to provide citation diversity statements? It was something that was taken on in the engineering field quite well, and it kind of increased a little bit in neuroscience, and it died down. But of course, one of the very clear issues with this type of work is that by just using a name, you can't, using a name isn't a very good and accurate measure of a person's gender. And so there's a bias here, and so you don't really want, basically it's a very flawed approach in our opinion. And so I would just like to put out there that this is an open discussion, and if anyone has any ideas on how to approach this, please contact me, email me, write a nice paper on it and send it to me. We are really interested in this and trying to help in this area. So the other aspect is that women are underrepresented in editorial boards. So this is another nice paper that came out by Katerina Fotopoulou's group at UCL, and they looked at the representation of men and women in editorial boards. So on the far left, you can see in general across neuroscience, there's a pretty dramatic preponderance of men versus women in editorial boards. And so you might think again that this is because there are more. They've got the leaky pipeline. There's more men at the at the top of the food chain at the moment. But actually, if you look to the right, that shows second from the left is editor-in-chiefs, associate editors, and advisory editors on the far right. And advisory editors tend to be ECRs, and we know that at that level there tends to be a much more equal split in representation within science, neuroscience generally. So there is definitely a bias towards more men taking on these editorial positions than women. So why is this? Is it that women don't want to be editors? Well, actually, interestingly, in that paper, that was the case. Women don't want to be editors. And they did a lot of interviews with editors-in-chief and asked them about this issue, and they said that actually they contacted a lot of women and they were trying to get women onto editorial boards, but women didn't want to do this job. So it wasn't reflecting a lack of effort on their part, really. So what is the issue here? Maybe women don't want to be editors in general. I can speak from experience. It's not fun rejecting papers or getting angry appeal letters, but I think it's not the nature of the job that's leading to this female reluctance. And in fact, if you look at our makeup at Nature Neuroscience, we are a very female-oriented environment. Paul Lewis is the only man in our team. So actually, this is a pattern that exists across the board. Professional full-time editors tend to be women, and actually it seems like this, so it's not the nature of the job that's causing the problem. So it seems more probable that this is to do with childcare responsibilities and internal service roles, departmental committee roles, which tend to be taken on by women. And actually, this is something that's echoed when I ask people to review. So there's an issue as well with getting female reviewers on board. But female reviewers often decline because they say they have too many commitments, alternative commitments, and they don't have time to do it. So what kind of initiatives can we put forward at Nature to change this? So again, advocacy is the easiest one for us. And we've tried to commission work discussing this. And Nature just last month published this editorial saying that they're trying to really encourage more papers from female researchers and try and actively recruit more female reviewers on board. So if you would like to review for us, please get in touch, and we are trying to actively change this. So I've just had to very superficially scratch the surface, I think, of some of these really important topics. And I'd like to also, just before I close, draw your attention to the Inspiring Women in Science Award, which I think should be won by some neuroscientists soon. And it might be an area to look into if you're a female scientist. And also this, if you're in London, we've just put on an exhibition called What Does a Scientist Look Like around King's Cross, where we've gone around the world and photographed and interviewed scientists, and we've trying to promote the fact that the face of science looks very different now. So thanks very much, and happy to take any questions.